Hey guys, welcome to Franklin Woodworks. Today I'm going to make some challenge coin displays out of some walnut. The design I'm going for will have a modern look and will also use as little wood as possible. While many woodworkers look for that perfect piece of wood, I tend to look for the perfect, imperfect piece of wood. Flawless straight grain is just boring to me, but everyone has their own taste. I'm starting out with 4/4 walnut with cracks and knots. I'll fill all of these imperfections with epoxy that I've tinted a dark brown. I'm using dark brown to highlight the cracks, not hide them. Since the cracks can be pretty deep or even go all the way through the wood, I'll tape up one side so epoxy doesn't run out onto the table. On this particular piece of wood, I had to add epoxy in multiple stages, allowing the epoxy to settle into the cracks with no gaps. Once that cured, I did the same to the other side. Even though only one side of the wood will be seen once the project is finished, I wanted to make sure the wood is completely stable. And a tip I learned the hard way on a previous project. When you are filling a long crack with epoxy, start filling the crack from one end, leaving a place for air to go as the epoxy works its way down into the wood. If you just dump epoxy all over the crack at one time, you may have a big cavity under the surface where air is trapped, and you won't discover this until you start working the wood. It's a pain to have to stop what you're doing, add more epoxy, and wait another day for it to cure. Just saying. Once the epoxy has cured, I can run the workpieces through the planer to get the front and back flat and parallel. To increase the contrast in the grain, I colored some wood filler a very light brown, mixed it to the consistency close to, say, mayonnaise, and used a maxed out credit card to push it into the grain from multiple directions. Once the filler is dry, I give the workpiece an initial sanding, which in this case revealed I have a nick in one of my planer blades. I guess I'll have a little more sanding to do than I originally thought. Now I can begin to dimension the workpieces and begin to cut things to rough length. For the sides of the display, I'll need those pieces to be triangular, and they will need to be exactly the same. So I made a quick jig on my table saw sled using scraps of plywood and double stick tape. The coins will sit in slots, but a design feature I wanted to add is a place for a coin that will be placed flat instead of on its edge. This needs to be done before I cut the slots, so I use an appropriate size Forstner bit to cut a shallow indentation. The slots I need to cut in the top of the display need to be 7 30-seconds wide and 7 30-seconds deep. I figured that out through trial and error, and those dimensions work best for me. The blade in my table saw has a kerf of 1/8 of an inch, or 4 30-seconds. So I'll need a reliable way to cut an additional 3 30-seconds in each groove. So to accomplish this, I cut thin slices off of a piece of scrap maple and I dial it in until I get one that's 3 30-seconds of an inch thick. So after marking out the spacing of the slots on the side of the workpiece, it's time to cut some slots. Remember how I cut the sides into triangles? I'll need to match that angle for the slots, and in this case the angle is 23.5 degrees. Then I line up the workpiece based on my marks, make the initial cut, then add the 3 30-second spacer against the fence and run the workpiece through again. And repeat again until complete. To attach the sides, I clamp them in place, drill pilot holes, countersink those holes using a 3/8 drill bit that I've marked with tape for the correct depth. Then I use 1 3/4 screws to make the attachment. And a quick physics lesson. If you take an organic object, let's say a finger, and place that object between a solid, unmovable mass, let's say concrete, and another rigid object with both mass and velocity, let's say a huge slab of wood, the impact of the two masses will cause the soft organic object to deform. Quite painfully, I might add. Okay, now back to the project. I'm not using glue because of the many slots and nooks and crannies, Removing all the glue squeeze out would be impossible, and screws will work well enough. I'll plug the holes using oak dowels, and use a flush trim saw and a random orbital sander to get everything flush. Now, to fill in some tiny gaps around the dowels, I created some fine walnut sawdust, put a little glue on the gaps, and rubbed the sawdust in. Once that dries, I use a random orbital sander to get off all the excess. Make sure you sand away all of the glue, or you will be able to see it when you apply the finish. So I'll sand everything to 220 grit and break the edges, but I didn't want to bore you by making you watch that. To start the finish, I do the bottom first, flooding the surface with Danish oil. After letting that soak in for about 10 minutes, I wipe off the excess, flip the displays over, and do the same for the top. Only in this case, after the first 10 minutes, I'll add more oil and wait another 10 minutes. Then I wipe off the excess. I even use my air compressor to get the excess oil out of the grooves. After letting the oil cure for about 10 hours, it's time for one last step that really makes a difference in the look and feel of the wood. I thin my Danish oil with just a little bit of mineral spirits, and using 1000 grit wet or dry sandpaper, I wet sand along the grain with the thinned oil. It doesn't take any real effort, and this is some of the easiest sanding you'll ever do, but the result is a glass smooth finish that is hard to get with lacquer or any other spray finish. There's probably 1,000 or more ways to make a coin display. This is just how I chose to do these. Plus, you learned about wet sanding, using sawdust, and I threw in a physics lesson. I think I've earned a thumbs up, a subscription, and a share. Don't you? I thought so. Well, thanks for watching, and there you go.